It was a quiet night in Florida, the kind where the air hangs heavy with humidity, and the stillness of the night is only disturbed by the occasional croak of a distant frog or the rustle of leaves as the wind gently stirs the trees. In the small town of Pine Bay, nestled in the heart of the Everglades, life usually slowed to a crawl when the sun set. People would retreat to their homes, seeking comfort in the cool embrace of air-conditioned rooms or the soft glow of porch lights. It was a simple life, untouched by the chaos of the modern world, where the swamp was both a blessing and a curse. But that night, something far darker and more sinister was creeping through the underbrush of the swamp. Something that wouldn't be satisfied with the peaceful existence of Pine Bay. It wasn't the usual wildlife. A bear looking for food, a panther hunting at night, or the ever-present gators sliding silently through the murky waters. No, this was something far more terrifying, something that humans weren't meant to encounter. It moved with purpose, and it was hungry. A first disappearance was hardly noticed. A local fisherman named Joe had gone missing, but that wasn't all that strange. Sometimes, people got lost in the swamp, especially in the humid, foggy nights where the path could disappear as easily as it was found. Joe had gone out on his boat earlier in the day and had not returned by nightfall. But his absence didn't send immediate alarm bells ringing. Maybe he'd gotten stuck in the swamp. Or maybe he'd found a new fishing hole and was simply lost track of time. But when Joe's boat was found the next morning, drifting aimlessly in the water, with no sign of him anywhere, that's when the first spark of fear started to spread through Pine Bay. A search was conducted, and though the swamp was searched thoroughly, there was no trace of Joe. No body, no belongings, just his boat gently bobbing along the water's surface. No one could explain it. The sheriff's office was called in, but they could offer no answers. They combed through the swamp, checking every nook and cranny, but it was as if Joe had vanished into thin air. No footprints were found, no blood. The only clue was the boat, but even that seemed untouched. Almost as if Joe had simply stepped off and disappeared without a trace. People tried to go on with their lives, but the mystery gnawed at them. As the days passed, the eerie feeling that something was very wrong began to settle in Pine Bay. Whispers started to spread like wildfire, each more unsettling than the last. People would talk about strange shadows seen in the woods at night, distant, echoing screams that echoed across the swamp after dark, and figures that seemed to vanish as soon as you turned your head. Still, the authorities insisted it was just an unfortunate accident. The sheriff held a press conference, trying to assure the citizens of Pine Bay that the disappearance was nothing more than a simple misadventure. He reassured everyone that the swamp was dangerous, especially when one wasn't familiar with its maze of water and dense undergrowth. But deep down, even the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. He'd seen things in his time as sheriff. He dealt with wild animals, natural accidents, and more. But this felt different. It felt unnatural. Then, just as the town started to return to its quiet rhythm, another person vanished. This time, it was a teenager named Katie, a quiet girl who had grown up in Pine Bay. She was last seen walking along the edge of the swamp, her backpack slung over her shoulder, heading home after visiting a friend's house. No one thought much of it at first. She had taken that path 100 times before. But when she didn't return that evening, concern started to settle in. Katie's family, along with a few of her friends, began searching the area near the swamp. They shouted her name into the night, but there was no answer. Once again, the search was launched. The sheriff's department came out, with volunteers joining in. The swamp was searched from every angle. But this time, there was something different. A trail of blood was found near the water's edge. It was faint at first, just a few drops scattered across the ground. But as they followed the trail deeper into the woods, it grew thicker, leading them toward a clearing near an old, abandoned cabin at the edge of the swamp. There, in the clearing, they found her. Katie's body was torn apart, her limbs mangled in a way that no animal could have done. The blood was everywhere, soaked into the earth, staining the grass around her. A town was in shock. Pine Bay, once a quiet and peaceful place, had now become the scene of something far darker. Rumors began to swirl. Some believed it was a pack of wild animals, a rare event where a group of hungry predators had attacked. But there were no claw marks on Katie's body, no bite marks that would suggest animal involvement. Others started to whisper about something more terrifying, a creature of the swamp, a legend told in hushed tones around campfires and during late-night get-togethers. People began to talk about the old stories, the ones that had been passed down through generations. Stories of a figure that haunted the swamp, a ghostly presence that was said to be a force of vengeance. There were those who said it was the spirit of someone wronged, trapped in the swamp for eternity, preying on the living. Others whispered that it was a creature. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery deepened. People who had lived in Pine Bay all their lives started leaving, unwilling to stay in a town gripped by fear. The murders continued, each one more brutal than the last. The victims were left in the woods, torn apart, with no sign of who or what was responsible. The sheriff's office was stretched thin, unable to find any answers. And the people of Pine Bay were left with only one question. What was happening in their town? Was it a wild animal? Or was it something far worse? The fear was palpable. It wasn't just the murders that were terrifying. It was the sense that the darkness was closing in. Pine Bay was no longer a safe place. It was a town surrounded by something far more sinister, something that could not be explained by logic or science, something that lurked in the shadows of the Everglades, waiting for the next victim to come too close. And as the sun set each night, a silent fear settled over the town. Knowing that whatever was behind these brutal murders was still out there, hiding in the swamp, waiting to strike again. It started with Emily, a young woman who was loved by everyone in Pine Bay. She had a heart full of kindness and a deep connection to nature. Whether it was the shimmering water of the Everglades or the chirping of crickets under the stars, Emily felt at peace in the outdoors. She had always been the type of person who would stay out late, simply walking along the edge of the swamp, admiring the quiet beauty of the world around her. On the evening she disappeared, she had told her friends that she was going to take a walk through the woods just outside of town. She mentioned wanting to clear her mind and enjoy the night air before heading back to her small cottage by the water. Her friends didn't think anything of it. It was just Emily being Emily, a free spirit who adored the night. As the evening passed and the moonlight painted the world in silver, no one thought to question her absence. They knew she would return soon, as always. But when the morning light began to stretch across Pine Bay, something felt off. Emily's friends waited for her to come home, but as hours turned into the entire day, her absence became impossible to ignore. A sense of unease began to settle over the small town as the reality began to dawn on everyone. Emily was missing. Panic slowly crept through the tight-knit community. Her friends searched her house, hoping to find her there, thinking she might have simply stayed out too late. But there was no sign of Emily. Her cottage was undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the lingering silence. Emily wasn't the type to disappear without a word. The next logical step was to search the woods where she had been walking the night before. But as the search party gathered at the edge of the woods, no one could shake the growing feeling that something terrible had happened. Pine Bay, a town that had been so peaceful for so long, was suddenly thick with tension. Days passed, and the search continued, but Emily was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until a week later that the first sign of her appeared, though no one could have ever imagined what they would find. It was early in the morning when a local fisherman while casting his nets near the edge of the Everglades, saw something out of place. There, partially submerged in the shallow waters, was a body. It wasn't just any body. It was Emily's. But this was not the Emily that everyone had known. Her body was unrecognizable, torn apart in a way that sent a shockwave through the town. The horror of the discovery was beyond comprehension. Emily's body had been brutally mutilated. Her limbs were bent at unnatural angles, and parts of her skin were shredded as if torn by something with enormous strength. There were no obvious marks of an animal attack, no claw marks or bite wounds. Instead, the damage appeared to be something more methodical, deliberate. The blood around her body had long since dried, staining the ground in dark streaks. But what was most chilling was the absence of any sign of a struggle. Emily's clothes were still mostly intact, and there was no sign of her having fought back. It was as if she had been taken by surprise, and whatever had done this to her had moved with terrifying precision. The authorities were called immediately, and the town's police department, alongside a team of investigators, rushed to the scene. The shock of the discovery hit everyone like a cold wave, and the realization that something far darker was at play began to settle in. How could this have happened? Who or what could have done this? There were no answers. Sheriff Allen, who had been working in Pine Bay for over a decade, stood over Emily's body, his face pale as he surveyed the scene. He had seen his share of gruesome accidents and animal attacks over the years, but this was something completely different. It wasn't the work of a bear, a wild cat, or any other predator that roamed the Everglades. No, this was something else. The way Emily's body had been mangled, the way she had been left in such a disturbingly calculated manner, felt unnatural. As if someone, something, had done this intentionally, with malice. As the investigation continued, there was no evidence that could explain the brutal murder. No fingerprints, no physical clues, no sign of the killer's presence. The only thing the sheriff could find was a strange, faint odor in the air, like something rotting deep within the swamp. It was subtle, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The swamp had always been a place full of mystery and danger. But this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. Whispers spread quickly through Pine Bay, each more unnerving than the last. People started to speak of a figure lurking in the woods, someone or something moving silently between the trees. The descriptions varied. Some claimed it was a shadow, a fleeting figure that could barely be seen in the corner of your eye. Others said it was a tall, thin man who never spoke and seemed to glide through the forest without making a sound. But there was one thing that everyone agreed on. The killer moved like a shadow. He was never seen directly, always just out of sight, never making a sound, never leaving a trace. It was as if the killer was invisible, haunting the town without anyone knowing. In the days that followed, the town of Pine Bay became a ghost of its former self. People started locking their doors earlier, keeping their windows closed tight, and avoiding the woods at all costs. The thought of the killer still being out there, somewhere in the swamp, drove fear into the hearts of everyone. But it wasn't just fear that gripped the town. It was a growing sense of paranoia. Who could be trusted? Was the person sitting next to you at the diner the same one who had committed such a horrific act? Or were they hiding something? The fear was all-consuming, and people started to keep to themselves, avoiding unnecessary interactions. Despite the mounting terror, life went on, though it was different. The sheriff continued his investigation, and although they had found no solid leads, there were rumors that a second body had been discovered. But the details were scarce, and the whispers about the second victim remained vague. The brutality of Emily's death was still fresh in everyone's mind, and it was clear to the residents of Pine Bay that whatever had killed her wasn't finished yet. The darkness had only just begun to stretch its fingers through the town, and no one knew who or what would be next. The killer, it seemed, was watching, waiting. And as the sun set each evening, the people of Pine Bay couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow lurking in the woods was growing closer. No one knew who it was. No one knew why. All they knew was that the horror of the Everglades was very real, and it had just begun. The name, the Florida Night Stalker, started as a whisper. It wasn't long before it became the talk of Pine Bay, a small town that had always been safe, quiet, and far from the hustle and bustle of big city life. The name sent shivers down spines, a chill that could be felt even on the warmest nights. It was born out of fear. Fear of something that could move in the dark without being seen. Something that could leave behind destruction and death without leaving a trace. It was the unknown that terrified people the most. And the worst part was that no one had ever seen the killer's face. The authorities had no leads. The detectives had no clues. They had no description, no suspects, nothing but the stories and the bodies. Some people swore that they had heard strange noises in the woods, particularly on the nights when the full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. They spoke of the sound of footsteps, but when they went looking, there was nothing. The swamp was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A few residents swore they'd seen something, a fleeting shadow in the corner of their vision. a movement between the trees, but each time they turned their heads to get a better look, the shadow would vanish. Others claimed that on the darkest of nights, they felt as if they were being watched, as if something was lurking just out of reach. Yet every search came back empty. No one ever found anything. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing. It was as though the killer was nothing more than a ghost, slipping through the trees, forever out of reach. The killings had started with Emily, a brutal attack that shook the entire community. When the second body was found, another local girl, brutally torn apart in the same eerie manner. The whispers turned into full-blown rumors. Some of the older residents of Pine Bay began to tell stories. Stories of a dark figure who had stalked the swamps for generations, waiting for the right time to emerge. They spoke of a creature not entirely human, but something far more terrifying, a figure that could slip into the shadows without a trace, a force of nature that could take a life and disappear before anyone had the chance to react. These tales were not new to the town, but now they felt more real, more urgent. The people who once dismissed these stories as mere folklore now found themselves wondering if there was some truth to them. As the murders continued, the town became more and more isolated. The once bustling streets grew quiet after dark. Shops closed earlier, and families stayed indoors, afraid to venture outside when the sun went down. The air in Pine Bay felt heavy with tension, and the once inviting forests and marshlands now felt like a maze of danger. The Everglades, which had once been a peaceful backdrop for their lives, now seemed to hold dark secrets. Secrets that were being uncovered with each new body. People began to lock their doors at dusk, the sounds of deadbolts and chains being fastened, echoing through the town. No one walked alone anymore, and the night felt like a time to be feared. Parents gathered their children indoors as soon as the evening rolled in, and even the bravest souls, the ones who had never been afraid of the dark, now walked with their heads down, eyes scanning the shadows, every sound magnified, every whisper of wind a potential threat. But even these precautions didn't seem to make a difference. The killer didn't care about locked doors or closed windows. He moved like a shadow, a presence that could not be contained by walls or fences. No one was safe, not even those who thought they were. Each new murder was more brutal than the last. The victims were found in the same horrifying state, their bodies torn apart with the same disturbing precision. There was no sign of any struggle, just the bodies left in the woods, abandoned like discarded dolls, their eyes wide open in terror. The killer didn't leave a mark or a clue. It was as though he had a way of erasing his presence from the scene of the crime, leaving only destruction in his wake. And with each body, the fear grew. With each new victim, the terror seemed to creep deeper into the town's very foundation. People began to believe that this wasn't just a killer. This wasn't just a man or a beast. This was something far more malevolent, something that had been born from the swamp itself. The Florida Night Stalker had become more than just a name. It had become a symbol of everything the town feared. Rumors spread even faster than the killings. Some said the killer was a ghost, a restless spirit that had come back from the dead to exact vengeance on the living. Others spoke of a creature, a figure that was neither man nor beast, something monstrous that had been awakened by the blood spilled in the swamp. But no one had any proof. The sheriff's department was helpless, and the residents were growing desperate. The town, that had once been known for its charm and peaceful life, was now marked by fear. It was a town where everyone looked over their shoulder, where no one felt safe after dark. Even the brave men and women of Pine Bay, those who had stood strong through the darkest of times, began to crumble under the pressure. They didn't know who to trust. They didn't know where the killer would strike next. They didn't know how to stop it. The sheriff, a man who had spent his life serving the people of Pine Bay, was now consumed by the same fear that gripped his town. He would stand in his office at night, staring out the window, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just outside. Something watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. But the truth was, no one knew what to look for. The killer wasn't a man they could track down, or a creature they could hunt. He was a shadow, something that moved through the town unnoticed, always just out of reach. Every time they thought they were close to finding him, he slipped away, as if mocking their efforts. It became clear that this was no ordinary murderer. The Florida Night Stalker wasn't just a killer. He was a force that could not be fought, could not be caught. He was the fear that gripped Pine Bay, the unknown that lurked in the darkest corners of the town. And with each passing day, as the murders continued, the legend of the Florida Night Stalker grew. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a warning, a curse that had taken hold of Pine Bay, and there was no escape. The townspeople were trapped, prisoners in their own homes, living in constant fear of the next attack, of the next body to be found. And with each new whisper, with each new rumor, the legend of the Florida Night Stalker grew stronger. It became something bigger than just one killer. It became a part of the town's history, a part of its darkness. No one knew when it would end, or if it would ever end at all. But one thing was certain. The Florida Night Stalker wasn't just hunting for victims. He was hunting for the soul of Pine Bay itself. And as long as the fear lingered, as long as the legend lived on, the killer's presence would never truly fade. Months passed, and still there were no answers. Pine Bay had become a town defined by its silence. The air heavy with fear and uncertainty. The killings had stopped, but the absence of new victims did nothing to relieve the town's collective anxiety. If anything, it only deepened the mystery. The police were no closer to finding the killer than they had been when the first body was discovered. They had set up surveillance cameras, but nothing unusual ever showed up on the recordings. The streets, once bustling with activity, now seemed to hold their breath, as though they too were waiting for something ominous to break the silence. But no one knew what it was. No footprints were found. No witnesses came forward with useful information. The absence of evidence was maddening. It was as if the killer had never existed at all, as if he were a ghost, slipping through the shadows, unseen and undetected. The town felt like it was under the grip of a haunting that it could neither understand nor escape. The authorities were stumped. They had no suspects, no leads to follow, and no concrete evidence to piece together. They scoured the swamps and the woods, hoping for a clue. But the more they searched, the more elusive the truth became. The killer had vanished into thin air, and with him, the answers that the town so desperately needed. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the sense of dread in Pine Bay became palpable. People tried to carry on with their lives, but the shadow of fear never lifted. No one dared to walk alone at night. People avoided the woods, and those who lived near the edge of the town would often look out their windows, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the dark. The quiet streets no longer felt like home. The town, once peaceful and serene, now felt like a place under siege, a place where the walls were closing in, and no one knew where to turn for help. The police were frustrated. They were doing everything they could, but it wasn't enough. They interviewed the residents, questioning everyone who might have known anything about the murders. Anyone who might have seen something strange or out of place. But no one could offer anything concrete. Some people claimed to have heard odd noises, but nothing that could lead the authorities in the right direction. Others spoke of strange figures in the woods, shadows that seemed to move on their own. But these were just rumors, stories passed around by the fearful townsfolk. Even those who had lived in Pine Bay for years couldn't remember a time when things had felt so wrong. It was as though the very fabric of their reality had been torn apart by an invisible hand, and no one could put the pieces back together. As the fear grew, so did the stories. They spread like wildfire, each more chilling than the last. Some claimed to have seen the killer in their dreams, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of their bed, just out of reach. Others swore that they could feel eyes watching them, even when they were alone in their homes. It wasn't just at night. Some said they could feel the presence of the Florida Night Stalker even in the safest parts of the town, in broad daylight. The killer had become more than just a murderer. He wasn't just someone who killed in the shadows. He had become a symbol, a dark force that seemed to hang over the town like a storm cloud. People began to wonder if he was more than just a man. Maybe he was something supernatural, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. The Florida Night Stalker wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a ghost, a figure that haunted their every thought. He existed not only in the shadows, but in the minds of the people who lived in Pine Bay. The fear of him was all-encompassing. It was no longer just about avoiding dark alleyways or staying inside after sundown. It was about the constant feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, waiting to strike when they least expected it. Some people started to see the Night Stalker in the most innocuous of places. They would turn a corner, and for a split second, they thought they saw someone standing in the shadows. But when they looked again, there was no one there. It was as if he could appear at will, slipping in and out of the town unnoticed, leaving nothing behind but the unease he created. The nightmares started to take over, and the lines between reality and fear began to blur. People woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, their hearts racing, as though they had just experienced something too real to ignore. In these dreams, the Florida Night Stalker was always there, watching, waiting. They couldn't escape him, not even in their sleep. And when they woke up, the feeling lingered, the sense that something was wrong, that the killer was out there, still waiting, still watching. It was as if his presence had infected the very air they breathed, making it impossible to shake the feeling that he was always nearby. As the months dragged on, the murders stopped, but the sense of unease never did. Pine Bay had become a town haunted, not by the killer's actions, but by the fear that he could return at any moment. The residents found themselves living in a perpetual state of alert, constantly looking over their shoulders, constantly wondering if they were next. The killer had left no physical trace, no evidence to suggest he was still in the area. But that only made the fear worse. It was the unknown that terrified them most, the feeling that the killer was still out there, waiting, biding his time. And as the fear festered, the stories continued to grow. The more the town tried to forget, the more the legend of the Florida Night Stalker grew. It wasn't just the fear of a killer on the loose. It was the fear of an evil presence that could never be understood, never fully confronted. He wasn't a man anymore. He wasn't a creature. He was something beyond that. A figure that existed in the darkness. A figure that preyed on the fear and anxiety of the people around him. The Florida Night Stalker was no longer just a killer. He had become a part of the town itself, a part of its history, something that could never be erased. And the people of Pine Bay knew that, deep down, they would never be free of him. He was a part of them now, a shadow that would always haunt their lives. It was a cool night when Jacob finally decided to speak up. For months, he had kept the horror he experienced to himself, unable to share it with anyone. The truth of what he had seen in the swamp, what he had barely survived, was something so unimaginable, so terrifying, that it felt like it could tear apart the fragile reality that Pine Bay had been clinging to. But when the fear became unbearable, when the weight of his silence began to crush him, he knew it was time to share his story, no matter how impossible it seemed. Jacob had been an experienced camper. He'd spent more nights than he could count alone in the swamps of Florida, enjoying the solitude that nature offered. He'd hiked, fished, and camped in places that most people would never dare to venture. That night, he had set up camp near a small, secluded pond in the heart of the Everglades. The air was thick with humidity, and the distant call of owls echoed through the trees. He felt at ease, as he always did, in the midst of the swamp's darkness. But then, around midnight, a strange noise interrupted the stillness. It wasn't the usual sounds of wildlife that he was used to. The croaking frogs, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional howl of a distant coyote. This was different. It was a low growl, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, closer, as though something was moving through the bushes. Jacob's instincts kicked in. He knew better than to ignore strange sounds in the wild. His heart began to race as the noise grew more intense. At first, it was just a shadow, something moving between the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. But as it drew closer, the shape began to take form. It was tall, unnaturally tall and thin, like a man, but with limbs that seemed too long, too elongated. Its movement was almost fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. And then, as it stepped into the clearing where Jacob's campfire flickered weakly, he saw its eyes. They glowed like embers, bright and intense, almost as if they were burning from within. Jacob froze. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. It wasn't human. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that made his skin crawl. The figure wasn't just a man. It was something much darker, something that didn't belong in this world. The creature's face was obscured by shadows, but the way it moved, the way it exuded an aura of malevolence, made Jacob's blood run cold. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, that the fatigue of the night had finally caught up with him. But when the figure stepped closer, he could smell it. The rancid, decaying scent of something that had been left to rot in the swamp. It wasn't like the earth or the wetness of the swamp. It was the stench of death. The smell alone was enough to snap him back to reality. And in that instant, all he could think about was escaping. He didn't know what this creature was, but he knew that if it was real, then he had no business being anywhere near it. Without thinking, Jacob turned and bolted into the woods, running as fast as his legs could carry him. He could hear the creature behind him, its footsteps like whispers in the dark, following him with a relentless persistence. He stumbled over roots, branches slapping his face, the sound of his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The creature didn't make any noise as it moved, but Jacob could feel it getting closer, its presence looming over him like a shadow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jacob reached the edge of the swamp, the trees giving way to a small clearing. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He ran until he could no longer hear the creature's footsteps, until the sound of the swamp was once again filled with the normal noises of night. His legs were burning, his chest aching, but he didn't stop. He kept running until he stumbled out of the woods and into the safety of the nearest road. Only then did he finally collapse, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It took Jacob weeks to even begin to process what he had seen. The image of those glowing eyes, the unnatural movement of the creature, haunted him day and night. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out of the swamp, something that would never leave him. But the most terrifying thought was that the creature wasn't just some random animal or hallucination. It had been waiting for him, watching him, stalking him through the night. Jacob's story was the key that unlocked the truth that Pine Bay had been desperately avoiding. The Florida Night Stalker was not a human killer, not a man in the shadows. It was something far darker, something ancient, something that had been hiding in the depths of the Everglades for centuries. Jacob's encounter confirmed what many had feared, but could never have imagined, that the creature wasn't just a killer. It was a force of nature, a being that could only survive in the darkest, most terrifying place on Earth, the Florida swamps. What Jacob had seen wasn't just a man. It wasn't a creature from some urban legend. It was something much older, a part of the swamp itself, born from the dark and forgotten corners of the Everglades. The Florida Night Stalker was not a modern-day killer, nor was it a mere ghost. It was something primal, a being that had learned to live in the shadows, feeding off fear, death, and the twisted darkness of the swamp. It was a monster, something that had survived for centuries by hiding in plain sight, always lurking, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Jacob's story spread through Pine Bay like wildfire, each word more chilling than the last. People who had once dismissed the killer as a man, perhaps a deranged serial killer, now realized that they were dealing with something much worse. The Florida Night Stalker wasn't just a man. It was an ancient evil, a thing that had been in the Everglades long before anyone could remember. And the worst part? It was still out there, somewhere in the vast, unforgiving swamp, waiting for its next victim. No one had seen the Florida Night Stalker since Jacob's terrifying encounter. But that didn't mean the fear had gone away. The killer, or whatever it was that had haunted the town of Pine Bay, had become more than just a name. It was a presence, a shadow that lingered over the town like a storm cloud, always just out of sight, always waiting. The people of Pine Bay still couldn't shake the feeling that the creature, whatever it was out there, watching them from the trees, from the waters, from the dark corners of the swamps. The night was no longer just a time of rest. It had become something to fear. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a twig, sent shivers down their spines. It was as if the Florida Night Stalker was still there, somewhere deep in the Everglades, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. A sense of dread that had gripped Pine Bay months ago was still very much alive. People moved about their daily lives, but the shadows of the night hung heavy over them. They no longer felt safe in the comfort of their own homes. The killer hadn't been caught, hadn't been seen, but that only made the terror worse. Without a face, without a body, the fear had grown even more monstrous. It was a fear that couldn't be explained, a fear that couldn't be reasoned away. The idea that the Florida Night Stalker could still be out there, lurking in the shadows, made it impossible for anyone to truly relax. Every dark alley, every corner of the town, every stretch of the swamp seemed like a potential hiding place for the killer. And no matter how much time passed, no one could ever truly escape that fear. Whispers spread through the town, stories that were passed down from person to person. Some claimed to have seen the figure in their dreams, tall, thin, with eyes that glowed like embers. Others swore they could feel the presence of the Night Stalker, even when they were in the safety of their homes. It was as if the creature had become a part of their lives, a constant companion that never left them alone. The night wasn't just dark anymore. It was filled with the possibility of something horrifying, something that could take them at any moment. It was a terror that didn't stop when the sun came up. It lingered, hanging over every breath they took, every step they made. The rumors that the Florida Night Stalker was more than just a legend began to spread with increasing intensity. Some people believed it was a warning, a curse that had been placed on the town of Pine Bay long ago, a curse that could never be lifted. No one knew where the curse had come from or why it had been placed on the town, but the belief in it had taken root deep in the hearts of the residents. They believed the Night Stalker wasn't just a killer who had slipped into their town from the shadows. It was something far older, something far more dangerous. It was a creature born from the swamp, a being that had been hiding in the dark for centuries, feeding off fear and death. Some said it had always been there, hidden in the depths of the Everglades, waiting for the right time to emerge. Others believed that it was the spirit of something wronged, a curse that had been passed down through generations. Whatever the truth was, the fear had taken hold of the town in a way that couldn't be shaken off. Pine Bay had become a town marked by darkness, and no one could escape its grip. And then there were the whispers, the voices that came in the dead of night. The people of Pine Bay couldn't say exactly when they first started hearing them, but they all agreed that they had become more frequent, more urgent. Sometimes it sounded like a voice calling from the trees, calling from the swamp. Other times, it was just a rustle, a faint sound in the distance, but it always carried with it the weight of something sinister. The voices came from nowhere, and yet they always felt like they were right behind you. Some people said they heard the Night Stalker's voice, low and guttural, as though it were beckoning them, daring them to venture out into the night. The whispers never made sense, but the fear they created was palpable. It was as if the killer was still there, even if no one could see him. It was as if he was calling to them, reminding them that the terror wasn't over. It had only just begun. The nightmares were another sign that the terror had never truly ended. People who had been living in Pine Bay for years began to wake up in cold sweats, their hearts racing, gasping for air. The Florida Night Stalker had become a presence in their dreams, appearing as a shadow in the darkness, lurking at the edge of their vision. The figure was always just out of reach, always just beyond the light. But it was there, and it was watching. The dreams were vivid, so real that they would wake up with the taste of fear still fresh in their mouths, their bodies tense and afraid. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was an invasion, a reminder that the killer hadn't disappeared. He was still there, in their minds, in their sleep, waiting. And then there were the inexplicable things. People who had never believed in ghosts or curses started seeing things. Shadows moving in the corner of their eyes. Figures standing just out of sight. Figures that would vanish the moment they tried to look. People started avoiding certain parts of the town. Parts that they used to love, but now felt haunted. The swamp was no longer a place of peace, it was a place of terror. People could feel eyes on them, even when they were alone, even when they were inside their homes. The Florida Night Stalker had become a part of the very air they breathed. It was in the wind that rustled through the trees, in the dark corners of the rooms, in the water that reflected the moonlight. It was everywhere, and no matter how much they tried to escape it, they couldn't. Pine Bay had changed. The people were no longer the same. They had become prisoners of their own fear, unable to escape the terror that had taken hold of their town. They lived in a perpetual state of unease, wondering if the killer would return, wondering when the next victim would be claimed. The town felt cursed, and there was no way to break the curse. The Florida Night Stalker had left a mark on the people of Pine Bay, a mark that could never be erased. As the years passed, the stories of the Night Stalker faded into legend. New people moved into Pine Bay, unaware of the dark history that hung over the town like a cloud. But those who had lived through the terror, those who had felt the shadow of the Night Stalker over their lives, knew the truth. They knew that the terror never truly ends. It may fade into the background for a while, but it always comes back, always waiting for the right moment to strike again. The Florida Night Stalker wasn't just a man. It wasn't just a creature. It was a warning. It was a curse, and it would never truly be gone.